when we started this. This is such a new type of format, such a new type of endeavor. Of course, Zoom is kind of new technology anyway. It's interesting how necessity is the mother of invention. And Pastor Sonny talked about during the economic downturn of 2008, some of the great companies that we use regularly now were formed during that time, like Uber and Airbnb. And there are some things that are being born in this time. Zoom being one of them. The founder of Zoom, I said this a couple of weeks ago, the founder of Zoom is the newest person to be listed on the billionaires list. And I think 6 months ago, maybe 3 months ago, most of us didn't know what Zoom was. And now it's become essential part of many of our lives. It's how many of us are conducting business. We had our staff meeting today with all of our church team, and everybody was on Zoom, and everybody was in their own space, but we were all together. And so it is giving us this opportunity to close the distance and come within proximity of one another. And even in the midst of that, there are always challenges to new things. And one of the things that we're talking about internally, Pastor Sonny and I have been talking about it at great length the last week to 10 days, about what does church look like when we come out of this pandemic. I don't think it looks the same. And quite honestly, in the spirit of necessity being the mother of invention, I think that's okay. We had a pastor one time who used to have this line. It's actually Brian Russo's dad, Pastor Ed Russo from Victorious Life Church in Tampa, Florida. He said, change brings growth and growth brings change. I think sometimes we get stuck in what it is that we're doing, particularly if it's successful. And we don't push ourselves to the edges of our limitations. And when you look at the life of Paul pushed himself constantly to the edge. He could easily have rested on his laurels. He could easily have gone to one city and started one church and saw lots and lots of people in that region changed and then just stayed there. But I've been praying quite a bit about what does church look like moving forward. And I think it doesn't have to be an either or. I think it can be an and. Pastor Sonny's calling it the new norm church. What is the new norm for church, and what does that look like? And I think for us to look forward, we look back. And in some of that looking back, Paul is a catalyst for that. When you go into the book of Acts, which of course the second half of the book of Acts is all about Paul. And we've really been doing a series on the second part of Acts to lead into a series on the book of Romans, which I said on Sunday is so interesting that here we are a number of weeks into a series on the book of Romans, and yet we haven't talked about the first verse of the first chapter of the book of Romans. And sometimes you have to slow down to speed up. Sometimes you have to learn your form. I don't know if you've ever heard the old adage that practice makes perfect, but that's false. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice can take bad habits and make them ingrained in who you are and what you do. When Isaiah was first starting to play football, we lived in Houston, Texas. And in Texas, football is a religion. he was so little. It was actually cute, y'all. I think he was in first grade, and he got the gear, and the pads were bigger than him, and the helmet, he looked like a bobblehead doll. And when we went to our first practice, it was in Clear Lake, which is a suburb of Houston, and he played for the Clear Lake Falcons. And when we went to the practice, for the first probably week, they didn't touch a ball, they didn't tackle, they didn't hit. All they did was get in their stance. First day, they learned the 2-point stance. All sports, most sports have the same stance. You call it the triple threat. And so for the first whole practice, which was like 90 minutes to 2 hours in the hot Texas sun, they just learned to keep their legs bent and to put their hand down without putting any pressure on it. And it was interesting because when you listen to the parents wanted to know, when are we going to play football? And to this coach, he had a theory that there's no sense in us starting to play football until we learn our stance. And I wonder how many people are living life without knowing their stance. Where do they stand on whatever it is? What is their stance on Scripture? What is it that we believe? What is your doctrine? What is your theology? Which, of course, is the study of God. What is it that you believe? I didn't know that for so long. And I didn't know that for so long because I just didn't ask any questions. And so when you look forward into what the church is going to look like, I think we have to look back. We have to look back to see how in the book of Acts did they really do church. And so the reason that we haven't started in Romans chapter 1, verse 1 is to be able to go back and figure out, what were these people really about? And so for us to be able to discover why Paul wrote the book of Romans, we have to discover who Paul was. And so we've slowed it way down. And this wasn't the intention in the beginning. In the beginning, realistically, I was going to start part 1 was like Romans 1 verse 1 through like Romans 1 verse 17 and talk about that. And then the next week go from like verse 18 to verse 25. And I think being in this lockdown has enabled us to really slow down. And so this last week, we got to hear the story about how Paul really started to become Paul, how it went from Barnabas and Paul, how it went from him being Barnabas' apprentice to him being Barnabas' partner to him being Barnabas' leader. And then as we left off last week, we saw this fracture, if you would, in the relationship between Paul and John Mark. And we're introduced to John Mark in the book of Acts, and John Mark is a pivotal person in the scriptures. And yet we see this chasm that happens between them. And then later on, as a result of that, we see a fracture between Paul and Barnabas. And I'm going to talk this coming Sunday about something that happened after this that involves Peter and a compromise that Peter makes, that Barnabas agrees with Peter's compromise. And Paul forgives Barnabas because they move forward. And in fact, they leave that encounter and they go to what's called the Council of Jerusalem. And Barnabas and Paul do in Jerusalem what they've done in all these other towns. And they go side by side and they speak this message of grace, and they play back and forth off of each other, and they change the direction of how the church ends up going forward. But directly after that, there's a real falling out between Paul and Barnabas. And I'm going to talk about on Sunday about how that fracture happened before it happened. That there was a crack that had happened when Barnabas really sided with Peter on something. And Paul has this huge blow up with Peter. And it's this, I mean, it really could have gotten ugly. But one of the things about Paul is many times we see that he lets his emotions get the best of him. He's this very passionate, emotional human, and a incredible leader who has these definitive ideas in his mind about how things are supposed to be done. And as we get into Romans, we're going to see how Paul kind of comes to grips with that. And later on, in fact, 2 Corinthians has some very telling lessons that Paul learned in his life about reconciliation. And of course, Barnabas is the son of encouragement. And I think as I read these stories about Barnabas and how he kind of aligns with Peter, and then of course he aligns with John Mark, who's his family, I think really that Barnabas is just living out what his name means. You know, in scripture, when you hear a bar, that means son of. And so Barnabas means son of encouragement. And I think he was just living out his personality. And I think, you know, he was friends with Peter before he was friends with Paul. And so I think in this encounter, he really is looking back on his relationship with Peter, and he's wanting to encourage Peter. And in this encounter with John Mark that we talked about last week, I really think that the straw that broke the camel's back is that he was really just wanting to encourage John Mark. And Paul was such a letter of the law guy in so many ways, which makes sense when you go back to who Paul was. I mean, Paul was this Pharisee, and he says he's the Pharisee of Pharisees. He's a Jew of all Jews. And so he's been trained in this idea of once you sink your teeth into something, he's like a pit bull, that once you sink your teeth into something, there's just no way to go back from that. And so, you know, what we see in this abandonment, if you would, by John Mark, I feel like in the message on Sunday, I could have camped longer on how this relates to our life. And one of the things that I said, and I just said it so fast, and I didn't even put it up as points, but when John Mark decided to go back to Jerusalem, we see three things that happened to him. And the first was that he forfeited his right to move forward. The second was that he failed to see the greatest move of God that the world had ever seen to that point. And so from this particular port moving forward, we see some incredibly significant things that God does. And I'm going to talk about one of those on Sunday, and I'm not even going to drip it to you guys tonight, but there's some stuff. There's one particular event that happens relatively quickly after John Mark leaves, that when you read it, you go, there's no way that this was actually happening. And literally all hell breaks loose. And I'm going to talk about that on Sunday. And so you don't want to miss that. But the most significant move of God happened simply because John Mark decided not to move forward. And then the third thing I talked about is that he fractured the foundation of a relationship. And he fractured that foundation of a relationship between him and Paul, but he also fractured the foundation of this relationship between him and Barnabas. And what I tried to camp out on, and I don't think I spent enough time with on Sunday, is that all three of those things happened in his life because he succumbed to fear and refused to submit to authority. And when you look at where we are culturally right now, there are so many people who are living their lives under those two things, who are living their lives in fear and who are living their lives with this refusal to submit to authority. And I don't know how that plays out in the lives of everyone on this call, but I certainly can understand how a pandemic can create fear in people's lives. Here we go. Yeah, fear can become our first reaction, particularly when you go to the store and you have to get essentials. You go to the grocery store and everybody else is wearing a mask but you. And suddenly you wonder, what is it that I'm doing that I shouldn't be doing? Or the opposite of that. And I went to go somewhere the other day and they had a sign on the door that said you couldn't enter if you weren't wearing a mask. And I didn't have a mask, and maybe I should have. But what's interesting is that many of us aren't allowed to do things because we don't have possession of something that we don't have access to. Have you thought about that? This idea that we're all being mandated to wear a mask, but you can't really find a mask. And I guess that you could make one for yourself. But if you're a typical guy who bagged off during home ec in school, the thought of sewing anything is just as fearful as walking around without having this essential mask. And so when we're put in this situation to live our lives in fear, it's daunting. And so I don't know what it is that you're fearful of, but I think that there's some fears in our lives that happen in spite of this. And I just figured out how to look at the comments, by the way. When somebody makes a comment, I can click on the comment and it brings up the comment. And so I'm going to spend another couple of weeks in the introductory kind of stage before we even get into the book of Romans. And so I did have a question that somebody had sent to me this week. And again, if you guys have any questions at any point throughout, then feel free to shoot those in now that you know that I know how to do it. And my friend Caleb sent me a question this week that said, what is the third heaven? And or it talks about where Paul said, in 14 years ago, I knew a man and he was taken to the third heaven. And that can be misleading. By all accounts, from all of my understanding, really what he's referring to is just heaven. And the first and second heaven would be the sky and space. I mean, they weren't, they didn't have the Hubble telescope like we have now. And so I don't know how they perceived day and night. If they thought that it was two different skies, or if there was a place above the sky. And so it's reasonable to think that when Paul was talking about the third heaven, he was just talking about heaven as we would perceive it. And the first heaven would be the sky, and the second heaven would be space, or what we know as outer space now. And I think when you read Dante, I don't know if you guys have ever read anything by Dante, but I think it's in Dante's Inferno where he refers to levels of heaven, and I think it's been a few years since I read it, but I'm pretty sure that he refers to 7 levels of heaven, and that's less Judeo-Christian and more in line with Islam. When you read in the Quran, which if you haven't read the Quran, I don't recommend it. You don't need to read it. I think everything has a spirit connected to it. Pastor Sonny and I are really big on this when we talk to our kids. That's why you have to be careful the things you watch and the things that you listen to. And my brother's a psychologist, and when he was doing his dissertation during his doctoral program, one of the studies that he was a part of is they did a study on the effects of music. And so what they would do is they would take these people, college students, who had volunteered and were being compensated for it. So I put that as a disclaimer. And so they took these people, these college students, and they put them in a room, and they put headphones on them, and then they put pads on them to monitor their heart rate, and pads on their head to monitor their brain waves. And then they would play particular kinds of music, and they would monitor their moods, if you would, their heart rate, their pulmonary rate, their brain waves. And when they would play Mozart, it would have one particular effect. And then when they would play Metallica, it would have a different effect. And one of the things that I discovered years ago, I watched this guy. It's actually the guy who I got the idea for this Ask the Pastor. Years ago when I was a kid, there's still AM radio. I'm still one of those nerds who listens to NPR. I was listening to NPR News this morning. And so I have my Alexa in my kitchen set to, when I say, Alexa, what's the news? It brings up NPR. That's my news. And my favorite podcasts, I'm not a big podcast guy, but my favorite podcasts are actually NPR podcasts. I really love Guy Raz, and he's actually Jimmy Fallon's favorite podcaster. He's the only guy to ever have 3 podcasts in Apple's top 10 simultaneously. And he's on NPR. And one of the things is How I Built This. And it's this brilliant podcast where he just interviews these CEOs and talks about how they built their business. And it's so great. And he's a great interviewer because he stays out of the way. He doesn't give his opinion, which I don't know if you've ever heard of anybody say that he doesn't need to give his opinion. But when I was a kid, there was an AM radio station in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, AM 580 CKWW. I still remember the call letters and the actual channel. And from 10 p.m. until midnight. Every Friday night, there was a father and son pastor team who did this program called Ask the Pastors. And people would call in. That's where I got the idea for this. I just was reminiscing on that show. I never was a caller. I actually never was a listener. I just knew about it. And, you know, Windsor's only 200,000 people. So when there's something that's, you know, really popular like that, then everybody hears about it. And so the son was a guy named John Council. And John Council did these seminars on music. And so he would take these records and he would play them backwards and do these things. This is called backmasking. And, you know, he would take like Metallica and, you know, he would play them backwards really slow. And there would be these subliminal messages that were played underneath these songs. And so when I heard about that, it gave me this notion that if there's things that are subliminally being recorded on the track of these records, then obviously there's a spirit that's going into this. And I've said this before, but Led Zeppelin used to do seances before they would go in and record their music. And so we have to be cautious of the things that we allow into our spirit. And I think that has to do not just with media. I think it also has to do with information. And so we have to be cautious of the things that we allow into our brain, because sometimes our brain will process it in a way that we don't intend it to. And so that's why I say rabbit trail closed. That's why I say, if you haven't read the Quran, you don't need to read the Quran. I had a friend who gave me a book a few years ago called Living Buddha, Living Christ. And it was the leading Buddhist theologian in the world writing his opinions about Jesus. And it seemed like an interesting aspect that I would want to know. And so I took the book and I started to read it. And about 5 minutes into reading that book, I felt icky. That's the professional term for it. I felt icky. And I couldn't put my finger on it. And so I put the book aside. And I waited a few weeks, and I thought, you know, maybe it was just me. Maybe I ate something wrong, or I didn't know what it was. But I picked the book back up, and I started to try to read it again. Exact same feeling, just this weird, like creepy, clammy kind of feeling. And so I took that book and I threw it right in the dumpster. And I thought, there's a spirit that went into writing this book that is trying to come out of this book and is trying to infiltrate my spirit. And my spirit and the spirit that was in that book were at war. Better yet, the spirit that was in me was at war with that book. And gratefully, scripture says, greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. And so when you read this book by Dante, it's leaning more, in my opinion, toward what Islam would think about paradise, or what we would call heaven and the afterlife. And so when Paul talks about, you know, this level of heaven, I don't think he's referring to the same type of thing that Dante was, or that the prophet Muhammad was, or anything like that. And so when we come to questions like that, when we're reading in scripture, a lot of times our natural reaction is just to Google it. And you have to be careful when you Google things, because you don't often know the source of what that thing. I mean, I could write an article about anything that I want, and I could post it online, and if enough people read it, then when you Google that particular topic, then mine will be the first thing that comes up. But you can also pay for that. Like Pastor Sonny and I are watching this show right now called How I Built, The Food That Built America. There was a show on History Channel called The Men Who Built America. It's fascinating. And then there's a new one on History Channel called The Food That Built America. And it's about these guys like Milton Hershey and, the Heinz guy. And it's just a number of people who changed America through foods that they came up with. And what's interesting is that you can go on Google and you can pay to have yourself become an expert in that particular thing. And so now, because of History Channel, if you Google anything about Heinz, History Channel could take their program, and if they want you to see it, they can pay enough money that when you put in Heinz, I don't know if they've done this because I haven't tried it, but they could make it so that the first thing that you see when you put in Heinz in Google is an advertisement for their program. And what I learned from Sonny in the midst of this, because she's in marketing, is that a food company, they can buy shelf space. And so if you want your ketchup, for example, to be the ketchup that everybody buys, then you can buy the shelf space right at eye level in every grocery store that people go into, so that when people come in looking for ketchup, the very first thing that they see is your brand. And Google works in that way. So you have to be cautious when you go on Google and you say, what did Paul mean when he wrote that he went to the third level of heaven? Just last night, Pastor Sonny and I were watching network television, which is it's an adventure now. It's like, ooh, live TV. We didn't know what to do when commercials came on. And so we stumbled across this guy who was teaching about the end times. And he was on a thing on Revelation, and he had this like huge screen, and we watched it for about 15 minutes. And it was interesting. And I actually took a couple of screenshots with my phone because I thought, ooh, I really like that point that guy made. And then I looked at Pastor Sonny and I said, watch, we're going to find out this guy isn't Christian. I mean, I said a particular religion, a particular false religion. I won't say it on here. But literally within 2 minutes, I was wrong about the particular false religion. But he came out and he said, now, of course, you know that I am a member of, this thing. And he said the religion that he was a part of. And it's very slick, the religion that he was a part of. And it was very misleading. And so we turned it off. We thought, man, we just watched this thing for 15 minutes about a guy who sounded like he was so close. And when Paul walked from city to city, he encountered these people who were so close, but they were just slightly off. And so he comes along and he confronts these people, and they're so entrenched in these ideas, particularly the people who are part of Judaism, who promoted this idea that you had to do particular steps to be a part of God's saving grace. And I'm going to talk on Sunday about some people who came to town into Antioch, and they were what were called Christian Pharisees. So they were what Paul had been. Remember, we talked about there were Pharisees and there were Sadducees. And the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducee, largely, the main difference is that Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. And the way I always remembered that, and this is so cheesy, but the way that I always remembered that is that in seminary, I had a professor that said, you know how to tell the difference between Sadducees and Pharisees is that the Sadducees didn't believe in the afterlife, and so they were sad, you see. That's even worse than dad humor. That's professor humor. And so I just always remember that. And so there were Pharisees and there were Sadducees, and they were all very genuine in their beliefs, and they were all very devout. And in Antioch come these people that are called Christian Pharisees. And so they were Pharisees who remained Pharisees, but they believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And when they came to Antioch, Peter was there. I hope you guys don't ever feel like I wreck Sunday for you when I kind of give you these bumpers. When they come to Antioch, they encounter Peter. Of course, people who are part of Judaism, they felt they would classify Gentiles and sinners together. This idea that if you were a Gentile, you were a sinner. And so, I mean, to the point that they wouldn't eat with Gentiles. It's like they were adamant about it. But Paul was a guy who ate with Gentiles. He just hung out with them. He just kicked it with them. And that in the beginning, that was a rub between Paul and Peter. This idea that Peter could not fathom that you would eat with a Gentile, that you had to stay like totally separated from them. And then Peter ends up having this dream, this crazy, weird dream where God convicts him, and then he goes and he eats with a Gentile. But then he doesn't really tell people about it. He doesn't like become the guy who eats with Gentiles. It just was kind of like a one-off. It was like God told me to do it, so I did it, and I'm fine. I survived. Like I went to the grocery store and I didn't have a mask on. Thank God I survived, but I don't want to do that again. It was like you feel like you just got lucky. And so like he survived it, but then he didn't talk about it. And even after that, when Peter went back to Jerusalem, he was still the guy who would only eat with Jews. And he because, Peter was called to the Jews like Paul was called to the Gentiles. And so he was the guy who not only was he only eating with Jews, he was still quasi teaching that. And then Peter comes to Antioch to visit because he's like, James, the brother of Jesus, really is the leader of the church in Jerusalem, but Paul really is, at the time, he's like the champion of the church. And he's really the evangelist. And James is kind of the pastor, if you would. And so they're both super highly respected by all of the Jewish believers, all of the followers of the way globally. But Peter hears about, what's happening in this town. And so he comes and he visits. And initially, when he gets there, he still won't eat with Gentiles, even there. But he sees something that moves him. He sees that these are genuine believers, that they've had a real encounter with God. And Peter has this change of heart. And so he's eating with Gentiles. He's just kicking it. And he's all in on this idea. And then these Christian Pharisees, as they're called, show up on the scene. And they're so angry with Peter. And so what their belief system would have been in a nutshell is that, yes, you can believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And yes, you can be a Gentile and believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But you have to convert to Judaism. And which means you have to follow the full law of Moses, all 600 plus of them, the rules. You have to obey the fasts. Obviously, you have to fully submit yourself to Shabbat or Sabbath. You have to be kosher, meaning that there's particular things that you can't eat. And you have to be circumcised, which is a pretty big investment for somebody when they're grown. And I'll just leave it at that. And so these guys come in and they see Peter eating with Gentiles and they freak out. And they're like Peter's a sellout. And they make such a big deal about it that Peter stops eating with Gentiles. And this is the interesting thing. The scripture says, and Barnabas agreed with them. Paul's boy, his homie. And he's just like, no, all right, well, this is what you say. I guess this is what we're doing. And then like Paul's like left solo on this thing. And Paul comes in and he confronts Peter. And it's like dicey there for a minute. And I envision now the more I know Paul, I envision Paul does not play. And I envision Paul gets up in these dudes' face. Like I think later on after the Council of Jerusalem, I think that Paul and Barnabas, I mean, they go back and forth, and it is aggressive. And I picture like these two champions of the faith being held apart with I wish you could see my arms, like, just let me at him. Don't hold me back. Don't hold me back. Of course, I have an overactive imagination, so I picture, these two guys like the Irish leprechaun, like they're fit to throw. And I picture Peter and Paul are the same way. And the reason that I think that is because we know they're both hotheads. When you read this story of Peter, Peter was a fool. And the same thing with Paul. And can you imagine an argument between this is just free stuff for you. This isn't in the lines of it. But when you read between the lines and you realize that these are real people, and when you realize who Paul is, and you recognize who Peter is. I mean, we're talking about a guy who cut a dude's ear off, like quick. We're talking about a guy who somebody said he knew Jesus, and scripture says he cussed out a teenage girl, like cussed her out. So we know that Peter's a hothead. And after Jesus dies, Peter takes his ball and goes home, y'all. He goes